At least 250 people are dead after Italy's earthquake as hopes fade of finding many more survivors. One of the last to be pulled out alive, a 10-year-old girl called Giulia, trapped beneath the rubble for 15 hours. Violent aftershocks are hampering rescue teams, sending more terror through already traumatized towns.
Let's just have a look over here, and you'll see all that dust has been caused by the new aftershock. I'm not even sure.
Tonight, a local official in the devastated town of Amatrice says there are at least 3 British nationals among the dead. Also tonight, tragedy at Camber Sands. 4 of the 5 young friends who went on a day trip to the beach and lost their lives in the sea. On the roads to Calais, masked people smugglers resort to violent tactics, blocking roads with trees to get migrants onto lorries.
Nigel Farage.
And he's behind you. UKIP's former leader takes to the stage with Donald Trump in the US.
In the south, concerns tonight as a police force fails to record thousands of reported crimes. And the highs and lows of GCSE results. We hear from the head teacher who's transformed a Portsmouth school.
Good evening. Rescue teams in central Italy are spending a second night searching for survivors of the devastating earthquake. 250 people are now known to have been killed. At least 3 Britons are feared to be among them, and the death toll is expected to rise. The 6.2 magnitude quake struck a group of mountain towns and villages in the early hours of yesterday morning when most people were sleeping. We have 2 reports tonight from the worst hit villages, Amatrice, 60 miles northeast of Rome, and Pescara del Tronto, where almost all the houses have collapsed. First, we hear from James Reynolds in Amatrice, a town which was packed with people preparing for its annual festival tomorrow.
Look at the town of Amatrice and see if you can find anywhere that hasn't been hit. The quake damaged or destroyed much of its historic centre, and it's still a dangerous place. This afternoon there was a large aftershock, enough to shake the entire town. The ground has just shaken again here, and the effects were tremendous. Just have a look over here, and you'll see all that dust has been caused by the new aftershock. I'm not even sure what to call it, but we heard and we felt the entire tarmac here, the entire ground move. The worry at the moment will be that rescue workers who were down there, you can see in the dust already working, that they might now have been caught. Elena Serafini is still recovering from the quake itself. She and her family were sleeping at home when they felt the ground move.
You can't understand it. It's as if you see the face of death. There was no electricity. A disaster. We didn't know how to get out.
We watched rescuers search the remains of this house. 2 hours later, they brought out a body. Family members stood nearby. This is what the loss of hope looks like. Relief workers, clearly exhausted, say it's hard to stay optimistic. It's so difficult, Domenico Cenfi told me. There's a lot of dust. The sniffer dogs aren't finding anything. Some survivors have been given a new temporary home in the park. The youngest may have no idea what they've all just lived through. And tonight, relief workers have pitched 24 tents for survivors. Slowly, they begin to arrive. More than 1,000 people now need a place to stay in their own town. James Reynolds, BBC News, Amatrice.
Well, just 15 miles north of Amatrice lies the small village of Pescara del Tronto. The population there runs to little over 100, but such is the devastation that virtually the entire village is now homeless, as our correspondent Damian Grammaticus reports.
From up high, you really see how this village tumbled down the mountain. Down there, teams were still searching today. But it was unstable, dangerous. Another tremor could send the rubble cascading lower. So everyone was kept away, while fire crews helped people who'd come back to salvage what they could. Francesco and his family all survived. All they can do is recover a few possessions. Their house is now uninhabitable. We spent lovely times here, lovely moments. Family and friends, he told me. But in this landscape now, there's no life or laughter, just an eerie quiet. Hundreds of years of history, of memory, obliterated. It's as if a giant wrecking ball hit Pescara del Tronto and smashed everything to pieces. 130 people lived here, at least 24 died. Maurizio Picciacchia knew many of them, saw them every day when he came to visit his grandmother.
We're talking about people I used to see all the time, my dear friends. Some of them have died. It's a disaster.
What you can see very clearly from up here is that it's the old part of Pescara, the bottom of the hill, that collapsed. People living at the top in newer homes survived. Down the hill, they died. 17 hours after the quake, though, there was this extraordinary success. Giulia, a 10-year-old girl, plucked from under the rubble. The rescue teams here managed to dig her free. Since then, they found no more survivors. Still, they search on, knowing at least 2 more people remain missing. One rescuer told us, though, there was little chance of any more survivors now. The town collapsed like a house of cards. The sand that held buildings together crumbled, and it seems it's unlikely they'll ever be reconstructed.
I don't think that could rebuild the same town. No.
So this is finished?
Yeah, I think so. I hope no, but if you see, the reality is different from the hope.
And the reality here is remorseless. A village broken, robbed of its future. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News, Pescara del Tronto.
Well, let's go back to Amatrice now, and James Reynolds is there. How difficult is it for the authorities, James, to establish just how many people may have died?
I think it's extremely difficult because this was peak tourist season. There were plenty of foreign visitors coming here, having their summer holidays or preparing for the summer festival here. And so the authorities are struggling to account for their whereabouts. One local official here has told us that 3 British citizens have been killed here. And the Foreign Office stresses that it is providing consular support. And Italians also have a number of questions of their own. The most simple, the most powerful is this. Why did buildings collapse? This is an earthquake-prone region. There was a big quake in 2009 in Aquila. More than 300 people died. After that, Italy decided that buildings should be renovated to obey the earthquake code. Clearly, as you can see, that did not happen. And Italian prosecutors have now begun a criminal investigation to find out whether or not anybody should be to blame for this.
James Reynolds in Amatrice, thank you. The 5 men who died in the sea at Camber Sands in East Sussex yesterday afternoon were a group of friends who'd gone on a day trip from London. Police say they were in their late teens and early 20s. It's believed they may have got into trouble after failing to realise how quickly the tide would come in. Our correspondent Duncan Kennedy reports.
They were friends from childhood who played football together and ultimately died together. 4 of the 5 men have now been named and include 2 brothers, Ken Natan and Kobe Natan. Also among the dead is Intushan Shri, whilst Nithasan Ravi was just 22 years old. His brother says the men had just gone for a fun day out at the beach.
My family is very disheartened. I mean, they don't know how to explain their agony. They're proper confused. They still feel like he's with us, he's amongst us. Especially those 4 others, he's very upset about the parents of them, how their siblings coping, just like me. You know, it's been a very emotional day for us. It's very unforgettable, you know. Yeah.
There were around 25,000 people on the beach when the 5 men, all in their teens and early 20s, lost their lives. Yesterday's tragedy took place extremely quickly. Emergency services were called at 2:10, but just 10 minutes later a second person was in difficulty, and by 2:35 a third person was being pulled from the sea. Then last night the bodies of the 2 other men were found in the water. Even today witnesses say they're bewildered.
I didn't sleep all night. Whole night I was just walking around in the bedroom. I couldn't sleep.
Did you think twice about coming back today?
Yeah, we did. And for my niece, it's her first time. She wanted to go to the beach.
But how did the men get into trouble? Well, some say it's strong undercurrents called riptides, whilst others say they don't really exist here at Camber Sands. Instead, they blame the huge undulations in the beach in conjunction with the fast incoming tide.
There's quite a significant difference between the top of the sandbar and the bottom. The tide will come in very quickly and people can become cut off and get out of their depth really quickly.
There's no lifeguard to intervene in these waters that have the power to overwhelm and turn a place of safety and fun into one of tragedy and loss. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News, on the Camber Sands.
Motorists heading to Calais are being warned to be extra vigilant at night as people smugglers resort to increasingly violent and shocking tactics. An investigation by BBC South East has filmed masked men blocking motorways with fallen trees, causing traffic to stop so they can get migrants on board lorries more easily. The authorities in Calais say the French army should be called in because the roads have become too dangerous for motorists between midnight and 6 in the morning. Colin Campbell reports.
It's 4 a.m. We're on the main motorway into Calais.
Jeez. So they've completely... Careful.
Entirely blocking the carriageway, a tree, dragged onto the road by masked and armed people smugglers. Using increasing levels of violence, this is the terrifying reality of Calais' highways at night. The roadblock causes traffic to build, giving migrants the chance to hide inside UK-bound trucks. The smugglers direct them to lorries, queuing behind us. In the shadows, they flank our vehicle. But then... an HGV arrives at speed.
Oh, look, he's hitting the car. He's hitting the lorry.
The smugglers turn their attention to the people they traffic.
Oh, my goodness, what's he doing? He's telling people to do something. He's grabbing that guy. He's hitting him with a stick.
Migrants who don't pay are often subjected to violence.
What are they doing now? They're moving it. So now they're moving the tree.
It's unclear how many migrants got onto trucks, but with their job done, the smugglers disappear back into the bushes.
They're off. The police are coming.
Well, we've now pulled over, but that was a really frightening experience. The people smugglers, the guys with the masks around their faces, controlled the whole situation with menace and threats of violence.
Yeah, another load of branches and trees. The attacks are constant and spread out over a wide area. The French police are on patrol and search motorway sidings with spotlights. An estimated 9,000 migrants are now in Calais. The city's deputy mayor believes the police need assistance from the French military.
The army could come to support the police and to stop the migrants to go on the motorway.
A tree dragged onto the road by masked and armed people smugglers. We showed our footage to returning British holidaymakers.
Well, I'd say that's pretty scary, and it certainly a bit worrying as to where things are going to develop.
Horrified.
Do not travel at night.
Travelling on Calais roads at night is running the gauntlet. Armed masked people smugglers and migrants often blocking the highway. Well, the roadblocks and the attacks are happening here in Calais between midnight and 6 in the morning. French police sources say there are around 30 incidents every night. Now, this weekend is going to be one of the busiest of the year, with many British holidaymakers returning home. The advice, if you are going to be driving on these roads late at night, is to just drive carefully.
Colin Campbell, thank you. The government has restated its goal of cutting net migration to below 100,000 after official figures revealed it remains at more than 3 times that target. 327,000 more people came to the UK than left in the year to March, a slight fall on the previous year. Net migration from the EU was 180,000, with record arrivals from Bulgaria and Romania. Ministers say reducing EU migration will be at the heart of their Brexit negotiations. NHS managers have suspended children's accident and emergency at a hospital in Stafford. The Children's Emergency Centre at the county hospital has been deemed unsafe due to a shortage of specialist staff. The trust said emergency care was available at other hospitals. More than 500,000 teenagers in England, Wales and Northern Ireland received their GCSE results today. Overall, grades are down to their lowest level since 2008 and have shown their biggest ever year-on-year decline. The proportion of pupils getting an A star to C is down from 69% to 66.9%. The overall fall has been blamed on tens of thousands of pupils in England who last year got less than a C, being forced to resit their English and maths. Results in Northern Ireland have improved and remain stable in Wales. Our education editor Bramwyn Jeffries reports from Ipswich.
On the Chantry estate in Ipswich, the first nervous arrivals.
My palms are sweaty.
I don't really know. Quite nervous.
Scared.
Anxious. I feel pretty chilled about it, to be honest.
Let's go! Golden envelopes containing happy news for some. Niamh did even better than she hoped. But not such good news for ministers, as overall results in England fell. This school is helping its pupils make progress, but here too they saw a small dip in results. No wonder they look nervous. GCSEs are increasingly high stakes. Anyone who gets a D in English or maths is going to have to resit if they want to stay on at college. And the effect of that resit policy is already showing up in this year's results. For Corbyn, even though he was chilled before, the relief of getting a B in maths was obvious.
Great, now I don't have to do them again. And especially with these results, I don't have to retake them, so now I can just get on with life.
But schools are under pressure to be more academic. More kids sitting harder GCSE subjects has also had an effect. It's about giving children here better prospects, say ministers, so no government apology for the academic focus. Instead, a reminder that employers want qualifications.
Are you all signed in?
Yeah.
More teenagers are signing up at colleges like Suffolk One. For Sophie and Jade, that meant a check on their maths skills. They got D grades and face resitting until they pass.
I've just never been good at it. It's just not like my subject that I'm good at.
I don't think it should be forced upon them when they've just left school and all that pressure.
This college gets a third of students through maths GCSE resits, better than the national average. But the principal told me resitting the same exam doesn't work for everyone.
The important thing is that the students demonstrate a level of competency and knowledge, and different qualifications obviously suit different learners. So for me, it's a challenge.
Results Day in England has brought plenty of questions, and this is just the beginning. Next year, GCSE Maths and English will be even tougher exams. Bramwyn Jeffries, BBC News, Ipswich.
An investigation by the United Nations has concluded that both the Syrian government and so-called Islamic State have used chemical weapons in the war in Syria. 3 years ago, hundreds of Syrians were killed in a large chemical attack in Ghouta to the east of Damascus. The moment marked the crossing of what President Obama called a red line. Our correspondent, Quentin Somerville, has spoken to some of those caught up in that attack. Just to warn you, his report contains some very distressing images.
The destruction in Syria today is becoming familiar, but in these streets a particular horror took place. Ghouta stands out. This is hard to stomach. In Syria's civil war, innocents are regularly targeted, and it's systematic. 3 years ago in Ghouta, they weren't able to wash off the poison, sarin gas. Hundreds died that night. Abu Saif al-Hamrawi was working as a nurse that night. In his arms, he holds 2 tiny babies, killed in the attack. 3 years on, he remembers.
Most of the victims were children and babies, and some mothers died immediately because they were sleeping, and by the time they realized what's happening, they couldn't move.
There's much evidence that the attack here came from forces loyal to President Assad. Damascus, though, denies using chemical weapons. For Abu Qasim, this is a war crime that's gone unpunished.
There were 10,000 people living here. If someone was tried with murder, he'd be tried with trying to kill 10,000 people, but no one cares. It's been 3 years since this crime, this massacre, and no one paid the price for it.
And it's a crime that's being repeated. In Aleppo, a suspected gas attack last week, chlorine this time. The regime was forced to destroy its chemical weapons stocks, but these children wouldn't know it. This attack is one of more than 60 identified by the BBC that show chemical weapons are still in steady use. And this was the town of Sarmin in March last year. The UN says it's certain that the Syrian regime used chemical weapons here, and that later elsewhere, the so-called Islamic State used mustard gas. But it was in Ghouta 3 years ago that a red line was crossed and threatened Western military intervention never materialised. In Syria, chemical attacks keep coming. Not as big as what happened here. Still enough to keep killing, and just small enough to avoid too much attention from the outside world. Quentin Somerville, BBC News.
The Labour leadership challenger, Owen Smith, has attacked Jeremy Corbyn's record in Scotland, saying the party has fallen into third place under his leadership, behind the SNP and the Conservatives. Mr Smith was speaking at a debate between the two candidates in Glasgow. Jeremy Corbyn said Labour's new anti-austerity message would win back voters from the Scottish nationalists. Our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, was at the debate.
Jeremy Corbyn did get a seat on the Virgin train he travelled on. Owen Smith flew in, saying that as a Welshman, he understands the nuances of Scottish politics. After recent electoral disasters, the Labour Party needs a huge turnaround in Scotland. Jeremy Corbyn has attracted thousands of new members to the Labour Party in Scotland, but they are still dwarfed by the SNP, who have stolen so much support from the Labour Party here. The question is, can Jeremy Corbyn or Owen Smith convince voters that they can win back Scotland for Labour? They were asked exactly that as the hustings began, asked what's gone wrong for the party in Scotland.
There have been obviously very tough challenges. The issues have to be the Labour Party's commitment to redistribution of wealth and power, to challenge the SNP on its austerity programme, which is so damaging to local government across Scotland.
We've gone backwards on your watch in Scotland. And the reality is, in the last year, when you've been the leader of the Labour Party across the UK, we have gone from second to third behind the Tories.
On Europe, will either man promise a new referendum or a manifesto that rejects the Brexit deal?
We will have the courage to put it back to the British people, to rubber stamp or to reject Brexit, either at a second referendum or in a manifesto at a general election.
If we're going to go into an election saying, well, there was a referendum, we didn't like the result, therefore we're going to ignore it, I don't think it says very much for our respect for democracy.
I'm not even sure Jeremy did vote in the general.
Owen.
I'd like to hear you say it, Jeremy, because I'm not
Owen,
certain.
I thought we'd grown up and we
about
weren't any longer going to use those kind of questions or those kind of remarks.
I'm still wondering why you haven't answered my direct question as to whether you voted in or out.
Owen, you know perfectly well what the answer is, that I voted Remain, and I'm very surprised and actually quite disappointed that you should even raise this question.
They talk about restoring party unity. Their faces tell a very different story. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Glasgow.
Now, how much of our data should police and the state have access to? That's the question before Parliament next month. The House of Lords is expected to push the government to give way on some of the more controversial provisions in the Investigatory Powers Bill, including keeping everyone's web browsing history. In the third in our series of big decisions facing the Prime Minister, our security correspondent Gordon Carrera reports.
In our connected lives, we increasingly leave a trail of data. The question at the heart of the Investigatory Powers Bill is how far police, spies and the state should be able to access that data. The most significant new power is the requirement that for the first time, everyone's so-called internet connection records will be kept for 12 months. So what does that mean? Well, what would be kept is the fact that someone had been on a particular website, like say a social media site, although not what they've been specifically communicating. It would also show if someone had been on a travel site, booking flights, although not what specific page they'd been looking at. It would also show if someone had been on a site hosting criminal content, such as child abuse material, or that relating to terrorism. When we make phone calls, police can currently get details of what numbers we dialed. But as we move to communicate through the internet, they say their job will become much harder without this new power.
By getting the itemised billing, we can work out who you spoke to, and then we can do normal law enforcement inquiries to then follow up that particular aspect. If you have done the same thing but you've booked through the internet, then all we get is the fact that you connected to the internet. We will not know who it is you're speaking to or the purpose for which you're speaking, and that really curtails our investigation ability.
And you'd get that from these internet connection records?
Yes, we would.
But those concerned over privacy say since we live so much of our lives online, details of all our web browsing will reveal much more about our lives than the phone records of the past.
So you can get the most enormously detailed life map of what people are doing, incredibly rich perspective on people's lives from a smartphone, which you could never get from an itemised phone bill.
The Investigatory Powers Bill returns to Parliament next month, and the parts which deal with internet connection records may face heavy pressure in the House of Lords, forcing Theresa May to decide if she wants to make concessions on a bill she sponsored as Home Secretary.
If Labour peers hear the strength of argument against giving the government these powers, then I think there is every chance that we can force them to think again on this. It is expensive, it is intrusive, and ultimately it's ineffective. I don't see that really having much chance of getting through the Lords.
Technology is transforming our lives, challenging everything from policing to privacy. And whatever happens with the specific provisions of this bill, the big decisions surrounding our data and who gets to see it are only just beginning. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
Nigel Farage has spoken to thousands of Republican supporters at a rally for Donald Trump. The outgoing UKIP leader said he wouldn't tell American people how to vote, but he stressed the party could beat the pollsters in the race to become the next US president. Our chief correspondent Gavin Hewitt was watching.
Mississippi is now Donald Trump country!
Mississippi, the American South. Donald Trump trying to fire up his controversial campaign. His theme, to the surprise of some, the lessons of Brexit.
I am going to invite onto the stage the man behind Brexit and a man who led brilliantly the United Kingdom Independence Party, Mr. Nigel Farage.
Donald Trump didn't quite know where to find Nigel Farage, but the former UKIP leader said he came with a message of hope that little people could take back control of their destiny.
And we did it. We made June the 23rd our Independence Day when we smashed the establishment.
Nigel Farage didn't explicitly endorse Donald Trump, but he was dismissive of his opponent.
But I will say this, if I was an American citizen, I wouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton if you paid me.
So how does Nigel Farage being here help the campaign of Donald Trump? Well, the Trump campaign want their TV audiences to see their candidate not as extreme or divisive, but part of a much wider anti-establishment movement.
Then it was back to the political roughhouse.
Hillary Clinton is a bigot.
And afterwards, the verdict on Nigel Farage, many here believed they were in the same fight as Britain.
We love him. He's wonderful. He's an inspiration to us. And we want to do the same thing. We want to take our country back, just like y'all did.
And as for Nigel Farage...
Are you comfortable in being seen as an ally on stage with Donald Trump, shaking his hand?
Well, look, you know, there was nothing tonight in that speech that he gave that I don't think by anybody could be construed as extremist or unpleasant.
Nigel Farage left, his moment in American politics over, but he stepped into a fierce political battle with Hillary Clinton today denouncing the Trump campaign as linked to America's far right. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Jackson, Mississippi.
And finally, the French fashion designer Sonia Rykiel, known as the Queen of Knitwear, has died aged 86. She'd been suffering from Parkinson's disease. She began her career as a window dresser, but by the 60s had become a fixture of the Paris fashion scene. Her striped knitwear designs, which were seen as an alternative to formal suits, earned her a famous following, including Brigitte Bardot and Audrey Hepburn. The French President, François Hollande, was one of the first to pay tribute, describing her as a pioneer not only in creating fashion, but also in her attitude that helped to liberate women. Newsnight is coming up on BBC Two. Here on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Good night.